All right. Welcome everyone to another impromptu episode of Discord in the Rings. This one being about new edition, new me. Get it? As always,
Cringe.
I'm as always I'm cringe, and this is the King, and we have another
Aye.
guest with us. We have a young Mr. Scott.
Scott Altman at that.
I don't want to introduce myself after that joke. I think I'm
I
gonna
know,
go sleep.
Go write another Dunlander blog spot. But introduce yourself to the people, Scott.
Yeah. So I'm Scott. I've been playing for 2.5 years now. Some of you may have seen my nonstop Isengard shilling through my blog, the Dunlanding Warcry, where I just talk about Isengard endlessly because that's the only faction that matters to me, and every other faction can just go to hell. I have some pretty good. So I typically play mostly competitively. I have an experience of competitive play in wargaming in general. My last game, shout out Star Trek Attack Wing. I'm the previous world champion for it, which technically I'm still the reigning because they haven't had a tournament since I won it. Thanks, WizKids, very good company. But I went from that, winning that, then into COVID. I moved from New York to Los Angeles, and then I picked up Middle-earth strategy battle game shortly after finally finding people to play with. And then I've just been hooked since. I played a tremendous amount of games. I use a lot of Tabletop Simulator because that's where I can get most of my games in. But I've been able to go to some big events in North America. I've been to the last couple LVOs. I went up to the first Clash on the Coast and placing 11th there, which is my first biggest tournament. With my Dunlandings on their debut. And then I also went to Adepticon earlier this year, where I managed 7th with my Orcs and Wildman spam Saruman. And then I'm heading up to Nova for the end of August and beyond.
Aye, excellent.
So I know a lot about Isengard. I play against a lot of competitive lists and all that. And yeah.
Yeah, someone a bit more level-headed and a bit more competitive mind when it comes to the rule sets compared to me and Commi, who play narratively in match play somehow.
Yeah, so I do a lot of FAQ analysis. I like to get into the nitty-gritty of rules. My dad, who is a lawyer, has always stated that myself and my brothers are cursed to eventually become lawyers because that's just who we are. So I do a lot of that analysis, make lists of questions to submit, even though people don't like me submitting 50,000 questions. The only question that has a bad answer is one that isn't asked.
It's a good way to look at it, and we do appreciate your efforts in the Discord itself. Like, you're always in the game, willing to help people out, as well as in the rules discussion and clarifying, even correcting me. You know, someone as wise and ancient as myself. I'm just clearly not put as much time in as I have for Scott. But when it comes to the new edition, my God, I am like, just, I want it and I don't want it. I'm like, yes, change. And I'm also like, oh no, change. Which I think is the mindset of most people when it comes to the new edition. Sure, there's going to be lots of people like, finally, we're ready for change. There's going to be people like, oh no, it was not broke, don't fix it. But after looking over like how Lotor SPG turned into the Hobbit SPG and how we're MESBG, I don't think the core is going to change. And even Jay has responded to a comment himself saying there's always room for improvement and clarity. To me, that screams the core is not going to change. Just we're going to neaten it up and probably make it better and more balanced. Which is, you can't really argue about making the game more balanced, can you? Unless you really, really are someone who just loves the unhinged chaos of these are always the top armies, these are always the bottom armies. Know what I mean?
I agree there that in the history of strategy battle game, we've only ever really seen quality of life improvements. There's been a few experimental things that have been like a little shaky and needed changing in the edition after. So like Special Strikes came in and were this huge innovation or wave that made a big splash when we switched from Lord of the Rings strategy battle game to the Hobbit era. And axes were able to do plus D3 strength at the time, so you had Hobbit Brandy Bucks who were swinging an axe and being strength 6, which was it was insane. And at that time too, like weapon swaps for free, and some units were like, because it was like still like entering into like the more competitive fold, which they had a competitive scene, basically their entire life. But as things kind of got more and more formalized, things like WOSes being 5 points for what they are stopped happening. Because I remember there was one GBHL tournament where one person brought Wood Elves, which at the time were like 7 points, and they came with Elven Cloaks, allied with Woses, and they all had axes for free. So they were all like strength 6 if they rolled the 5+ on their D3 roll, and they were just murdering things with their axes. And so that kind of stuff kind of got toned down for the Middle Earth era, as it were. And so I suspect that we're going to see some things that weren't quite working, like Heroic Challenge, to get some improvements, get some clarification in some places that like don't make sense, that sort of thing. That's my like impression. It's going to be a conservative edition change. But
Fair enough.
What spicy takes do we have here?
Oh,
Yeah, I'm in the same boat where I'm expecting that it's not going to change the core of the game. The core of the game has worked. They've shown it works. It almost hasn't changed. The only things that have changed are the outlying stuff, like the special strikes being introduced and then changed for this edition, then adding heroics, adding the warband feature for list building. Those are all like the outside stuff. They're not the core of run up, fight a guy, duel, kill each other. That's always been there. I don't see that changing. Just fixing up these outlying stuff, like Commi said with Heroic Challenge. It is the least used heroic in the game. The only time recently that I've witnessed it was it being used wrong at a game day I went to, where they thought that Theoden could challenge Glorfindel. Whether he could or not and come out on top is another question, but they didn't even realize they messed up. That's how little it's used. But other things I could see changing is I think they might rein in some magic. I think magic has started to crop up in large amounts recently. And I mean, I'm personally leaning into that as well. Some people have seen me recently running Saruman Witch King, which is the two strongest casters in the game, popped together, just overwhelming everything with consistent casting because their spells are just so good. I think that sort of stuff might get reined in. Now, it might not be a direct let's take magic and make it worse. It could be affected by maybe some changes with alliances. I know some people have talked about wanting to shift what is green, what is yellow, what is red.
Such as yourself.
I'm a big proponent of a little less. I think it's gone a little crazy recently. I'm personally a believer that there should be 4 tiers. I think impossible as a thing as it stands right now should be truly impossible.
I agree.
My prime example I love telling people is it is fairly unreasonable to ally Thorin and Dwalin on goats into Numenor. So it's an essentially unbreakable part of the army because you have to kill both of Thorin and Dwalin to break that side, which is just not going to happen in the average game. And then they can function and just obliterate everything. Yeah, it's there are some things that when it doesn't make sense, it really doesn't make sense. And now everything doesn't have to be perfectly thematic. At the end of the day, match play is the competitive side of the game, and you can allow for strange and unusual things, but some things should be limited. And that type of thing being a prime example. Now, could I see Lothlorien elves fighting together with the men of Minas Tirith? Sure. But when you hear the sentiment, at least of the Fellowship walking in to Lothlorien, they say, a witch lives in these woods, we don't trust her, yada yada. It doesn't really make sense that if they suddenly found themselves together, they'd fight together. They might be sketched out enough to not even fight together. And
I see what you mean, but I think a lot of the alliances are dictated from what actually, like, the actual events of the films, isn't it? And that's what I think. Like, I 100% get what you're saying with, like, Gimli is very mistrustful when they're in Lothlorien, and he spreads that amongst the group. But yeah, the Lothlorien do help the Fellowship. I think that's why they get a Green Alliance. But in match play thematic, it's very hard to balance that out because I think the game is very thematically based. It's like, yeah, let's do things from the films. Let's try and recreate those moments. It's great. And then when you bring like the competitive aspect into it, and you just kind of like, oh well, but that, this is unfair. That's unfair, and it's kind of like, yeah. I think it's a hard line to walk. I do. Sorry, it's Button.
No, I definitely get that side of stuff, and I agree to a certain extent. I just think, and it was brought up in one of the discords I'm in, that you don't need to have every tool for every army. There should be hard decisions to make.
Yep.
And with the current alliance matrix, especially with a lot of army bonuses being good but not like mandatory, you really have to make those hard choices. You can basically make whatever you want, even with the hero tier restrictions.
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah.
having, Fellowship and Lothlorien hang out together, makes sense since Haldir's elves helped out the Fellowship. And then, but I do agree with that point there, Scott, that like, why would Minas Tirith be so open-armed to give up their +1 courage to just, in exchange to hang out with Lothlorien elves and the sorceress? like if there's superstitions about the elves, and suddenly Lothlorien and Minas Tirith were side by side, would they be so ready to hang out with them for like basically no downside other than you lose some resistance to magic on Lothlorien, you lose some courage. And so I think to Scott's point, like if Minas Tirith and Lothlorien were red alliances because they never strictly fight side by side in the films or books,
and geographically, it's a bit of a way. You got to cross through Rohan to get to Minas Tirith, and vice versa.
Yeah, and they were in different theaters of the war too. Like it was the war in the south and the war in the north, and they kind of went different ways.
Yeah,
you see that also on the evil side, which stronger example of why some of the yellows don't make sense is when you're dealing at least with evil men and orcs and all that stuff. Those yellow alliances are about just as likely to fight each other than they are to band together to fight something. If you take Isengard and you toss them with a bunch of Far-Harad half-trolls, they might start killing each other.
Yeah.
I think there's a very good chance of that, even if they saw a bunch of elves in front of them.
And two, like in the inverse, like some yellow alliances that exist in evil, like maybe should be green alliances. It feels like some of the soup is somehow feels a little harder in evil, and maybe it's because evil's like kind of, I mean, at least to me, feels a little more in love with their army bonuses. Like Far-Harad really wants to have the courage buff, for being around their leader, and it doesn't hurt that Mordor gets a free war horn if they outnumber their opponent, and meanwhile,
a reroll
on the side of
one.
Yeah, rerolls the 1/2 wound for their warriors and all of that, and then like some factions that did end up fighting side by side, like we saw the Mumax march basically march alongside the orcs in Pelennor Fields, right? Like we saw them like in battle together side by side, but they're only a yellow instead of being green.
But with that, it's also where, as Scott's saying, like match play wise, I've got a feeling that was a balanced decision. We won't know for sure, obviously, but it is one of them where it's kind of like, Far-Harad, like it could have been playtested. Far-Harad attacked onto Mordor as green. They both got their alliance. Now you've got a bunch of fearless impact hits, as long as the king charges, with your rabble of strength 4 orcs who, as long as you're outnumbering, have a courage buff and a rerolled wound buff. It could have been a bit too much, but we won't know. We won't know, and we don't know.
My thought towards that side of stuff with balanced decisions is I think more often the balanced decisions result in an alliance going from green to yellow rather than from red to yellow.
Yeah.
So it's a downgrade due to power rather than upgrading things that are less powerful.
Yeah, right. That's fair. It does make sense.
Yeah. But there are certain sacrifices that have to be made.
Yeah.
There's no way around it. Certain things are very, very strong if you just allow them unimpeded. And of course, we do know that the Alliance Matrix was made before hero tiers were restricted. So it's not like it was the original intent for the hero restriction, so you could ally stuff a little easier. So even the strong ones that seemingly were cut from green to yellow didn't really, like, all you lost was the army bonus. You just take whatever you want anyway. Now it's a little harder with that because you have to shell out the points.
Yeah, for your valor. But then even then, some factions have a cheap valor, like Denethor. He's the one that comes to mind.
Denethor comes with additional baggage.
Yeah, he does. But he sits there as your army leader behind your Thranduil's elves wall of dudes, or however you want to do it. Yeah, I definitely think if the alliance matrix gets improved, I could definitely see if they made it 4 and impossible after it became impossible. It was something like you had historic, you had convenient, you had like if the world was ending.
I would do it.
Yeah, unlikely.
I would deem it unlikely. So it's ones that certainly could fight together, but could also fight each other or refuse to fight at all.
Yeah, I get that. That just makes every dwarf and elf faction unlike allies.
I mean, we saw what happened at the Battle of the Five Armies. I don't know how they're a green alliance. I really don't. So that seems like where there could be additional consideration towards armies that clash, not just stylistically but tactically.
Yep.
Where, yes, in this game, ultimately, the core tactics of most armies are the same, where it's a front line and a back line, and that's how you fight. And, of course, you could do that with Iron Hills halls or Erebor reclaimed halls. But when you see the events in the movie where their tactics were just so off, and it's the scene that everyone likes to say, what the heck on. You see elves jumping over a solid line of D8 dwarves in shield wall formation, and it's like, what are you doing?
We're showing that we're better, obviously, and that's why we're losing.
Ultimately, isn't represented in the game.
Yeah, it isn't at all. Yeah, it definitely feels more like a convenient situation than we are buddies, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like it could even be balanced out a little bit. I mean, yes, they might lose their army bonuses, but like you see how when you have Ugluk scouts or Kirith Ungol or I guess the other ones are outnumbering. So those two with animosity, you see competing forces where their styles clash, their goals, their tactics clash, but because they're trying to outdo each other, they get a bonus. That could be represented more in certain matchups and alliances. Where they are yellow, but they have this additional bonus that takes the place of it. And yes, of course, you could say, well, then it should just be a legendary legion, and maybe that's the way to do it. We could have more legions for these situations rather than just make them a green alliance.
Yeah, for sure.
If each profile is being revisited, there is that potential chance that, and I, maybe I'm not too keen on it, right? That there's additional text added to profiles or to to what have you, and you could have a reality where Iron Hills or Erebor Reclaimed, whatever, is yellow with Thranduil's halls to represent the fact that they are in fact convenient allies. But then also there's like a new generic special rule called animosity, and then in parentheses it says like the name of the species. So maybe Iron Hills dwarves and elves get animosity elves and dwarves, respectively, and that means that when they fight side by side, they get that +1 to wound bonus if they're with the named keyword, and then that way you have a dis-synergy because they don't get their army bonus, but you get a synergy because they have that flavorful special rule baked into their profile, which could be like kind of cool.
Yeah, that'd be a cool special rule to add in. We've got hatred, we've got ancient enemies. Why not have one that's for the other side? Your army consists of 2 different army lists, stat blocks, species, keywords, etc. There is that buff, but you would have to be careful where you place that, I think, and there would be definitely you have to actually think about how every profile is checked out, who allies with who and such. Yeah. No. It's a cool idea. It's a cool idea.
So I'm gonna say if it happens, we heard it here first.
Speaking of legendary legions, something I'm glad, and this is still speculation. I remember when there was rumors going around that the Allies Matrix was going to disappear, and we were going to have exclusively legendary legions as our means to ally. But with the announcement that they put out on August 8th, that the armies of books are being updated. It,
Mm.
I mean, maybe I'm just reading too far into the fact that they're the same titles of the books. Like, it's still Armies of Blah and Armies of Blah #2, but it feels like we're gonna be just seeing updated versions of them and
Yeah.
that will have an allies matrix rather than us having, we're now stuck inside of our borders unless a legendary legion allows us, and we just see LLs, take over the entire, playscape basically.
Yeah, well, when I saw that, it said like as well as the new supplements for Armies, Lord of the Rings, Armies of the Hobbit. I thought if a new edition was to come around for Middle Earth, that they would take the old world route and do Armies of Good and Armies of Evil and build it that way, but they haven't. So I've got a feeling it might be like maybe like something to keep hold of the license. They've got to do that. I don't know. But like I was definitely that's where my headspace was before we got our announcement. I was definitely thinking like maybe in a future edition we'll have just a book for Armies of Good and a book for Armies of Evil, but no, they've kept it Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. But with Legendary Legions, I've always it's almost forgotten because they are just usually upgrades to particular alliances and such. That it's a narrative themed force. It's like it's built around this idea for something from the films or from the books. So it's kind of like yeah, this force works together and it's very cohesive. You get all these extra special rules, therefore it's so much better. But it's like, well, it's supposed to be that snapshot. It's supposed to be that capture of this is how this force would have worked narratively, but it's introduced into match play, and that's how it just ends up usually being better than allying in. Like, imagine if we had like a Battle of Pelennor Good Legendary Legion instead of allying in Rohan, Minas Tirith, and fiefdoms. Kind of like Men of the West, where Men of the West is like a dismounted version of that, I guess, where you've got Minas Tirith, Rohan, and fiefdoms units all able to be taken together, and you get extra bonuses. Imagine doing that instead of just getting your army bonuses. If Men of the West was a better legion, it'd be a better example, obviously. But again, that just kind of shows like it's a narrative snapshot. It's a capture of those elements of that part of the film or book to me. And we do have a couple bad ones, but we do have some that are just stellar and just make the alliance like why would you ally New Dale and Erebor Reclaimed when the Legendary Legion's right there, making it 10 times better with its free hero combats and all your heroes are banners instead of it just being your guys shoot better and the dwarves treat Dane as a 6-inch banner. It's like, well, all my heroes are a banner. All of my dudes get reroll ones, rude rolls of 1 if they're near each other. And we've got the free hero combats based on traps, which, I mean, even King Bard? No, Prince Bard II, King Brand. Yeah, King Brand's even got a rule where he wants to be trapped to get an extra reroll on that. Well, I say wants to be trapped, but, if he's fighting warriors, he's usually out fighting them. Therefore, he's happy to be trapped. If he gets unlucky, but hey-ho.
Yeah.
The Legendary Legion just makes that group much better. But they're the defenders of Erebor. It's in the books, Unfinished Tales, I think. It's a capture of that, and it's like this is how this force should work together. So yeah, if they got rid of alliances and made it all Legendary Legions, there's only a finite amount of stuff you can do with that. Where I think having both an alliance matrix and the Legendary Legions, it gives you a lot more options.
Well, I mean, yes, sure, there's a finite number, but that finite number is still vastly more than we currently have. I mean, they have a lot of access to different time periods. Yes, for the most part, it is understood that they only have Third Age and Second Age that showed up in the movies. But Third Age is a lot of years, 3,000 years.
Yeah.
There is a whole lot that they can do, a whole lot of legions that they can make based on historical events. And I mean, not every legion, of course, has to be allied, but a fair few are. And I do really think that an alliance or a legendary legion exists for most of the alliances, especially the ones that are green, because the basis of the green one is they did fight together.
Yeah.
There exists stuff that they could do for all of those. And even some of the yellows, as we've seen, we see Moria Mordor with Assault on Lothlorien. There exists those alliances that cover those events enough that if they went down that path, I think it is a reasonable way to remove alliances altogether. There would be enough to handle all those.
Sure.
But of course, that also goes back to what I earlier said, where with the yellow availability, there's a lot less of I need to choose this or choose that. And a lot of armies can just have it all.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's necessarily the best thing.
Yeah, for
You
sure.
should have to make those choices, and Legendary Legions enforce those choices because, of course, units are just straight up excluded from them.
Yeah.
But I think between picking your base army or picking a legion that has some alternative options, I think that could be a way to do it, that it's not just take it all.
Yeah.
And one other thing that I have considered was previously there was just alliances based on point allowances. So with mercenaries or I forgot what Lord of the Rings strategy battle game called it, but where it was, I think 33% could be from a different faction. That could be a way to shift it up. Like a lot of soups might have that to begin with, but if it were a little more limited where you can only ally one other faction, that could also kind of rein it in a little bit. Some of them really get overwhelming pretty fast. For example, the list I'm using at the Nova Open is Saruman, Witch King, Suladan, which is just an unreasonable combination.
Yeah, you've got your massive 6-inch banner, two of the best mages for their cost. How many warriors is that?
I am at 60 models in that list.
Oh.
3 crap.
What is it? Is it
And of
wild
course
and trash?
Oh, it is, but at that point, it's about the overwhelming power of the casters.
Yeah, you're going to be shutting down their big heroes, and then your warriors should be able to make their way through their warriors as well.
Yeah, they get supported enough to be able to deal their damage. They have a big banner, kind of outlast stuff, outgrind, point denial is the whole game.
Jesus.
But it feels to me like it's an alliance that was never considered when it was originally designed.
Yeah.
It feels unreasonable. Like, of course, 1,000 points isn't quite the standard that most people look at the game as, but match play does allow for up to 1,000.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, we see it with Games Workshop events at Frodo Skulls. That's an 1,000-point event.
Yeah.
At Warhammer World, you know.
Just waiting to see folks starting that, like doing that list and then subbing out Suladan with the Dragon Emperor.
I considered it.
Dr. M.
That 12-inch span.
Not just his faction, but everyone's faction.
It was that or taking 3 Krebine.
Oh, 3 Krebine.
I chose the 3 Krebine because they're super obnoxious.
That's something to actually bring up, to be fair. So with Defense of the North, we saw a bunch of powerful things come from that. The Bjornings and Dragon Emperor's Legendary Legion that comes to mind. Jacket in the new edition, like, obviously there is a chance it could happen, but like, are either of you concerned that, you know, they release a new edition? Obviously, all of our supplements still work with it. Our profiles still work with it. You know, it's just more up to date. But then they release something new and it just washes everything out of the water. And then after that, a few months later, they release something else new and it destroys everything because everything's going to be they're no longer called Forge World kits, are they? Everything's going to be an expert kit, so they need to sell loads. Therefore, its profile is going to be busted.
So I think with any game, power creep is a thing. It's just impossible to avoid it. At the end of the day, on the company's side, it's about sales. They need to sell enough to make it worth it. And I get that. And they don't necessarily always consider the impact that these profiles will have.
Yeah, it's just a gun to the back of Jay's head. Go and make it good.
What I will say is part of the reason I feel I'm a little more successful than the average newer player, because I still consider myself newer, being only playing for 2.5 years, is the unwillingness to kind of build outside the box with what you take. And I think those legions that came out were a real wake up for a lot of people who were very much building standard lists with the XYZ formula to have this many models per 100, this much might, this many bows, that sort of thing. And the engines came around and they're not really the standard style that the previous ones were. And they were very strong. And I feel like those standard lists that existed beforehand just got absolutely bodied because of it.
Yeah.
They're still powerful lists, but I don't think if people went back and were building the way that I think a lot of people adjusted to building now and face those lists, even pre-nerfs, I think they'd have a lot more success. And I mean that's kind of to always go back to my style of building recently, where I'm doing Orc and Wildman spam with big casters. It's not a standard way to build. It never has been. No one that I've talked to has ever thought about doing it the way I do it. It's just so out of left field that even those style of lists, these new ones that are very powerful, have trouble dealing with it because it's just such a mixture of things that you don't expect. It's threat overload. Now, Assault on Loft did a similar thing where it had threat overload and had all the big shiny bells and whistles by being a new one, but it was still limited in some capacity. The casters not having that much will, or not being able to actually fight anything, or at the end of the day, I still think its shooting was just a gimmick. I don't think that spamming 20, 30 goblin bows was ever really the way to go. And of course, they limited it later. But it was threat overload. So even that list could overwhelm the others just on threat overload. But it's one of those, once you account for it, prepare for it, play your game prepared, I think you deal with it.
Do you reckon something similar will happen with the Angmar release? Do you reckon there's probably going to be
exactly what's going to happen? I think they're going to have some really nice bells and whistles, and if you're not prepared for it, it's going to overwhelm you. But if I think if you sit down when it's released and you take a look at it and you see, hey, what does it do? How does it compare to the way I build presently? How can I adjust such that I'm prepared for that while not also crippling myself against stuff that came before?
Yeah, I get you. So there's always an adaptation process. It seems busted, but if you actually just sit and adapt, you can find a way to kick it.
And while I don't have, of course, I joined in shortly before Defense of the North came out, so I didn't necessarily see that adjustment process beforehand. I think how many supplements are coming out before that, it was kind of not as big of a deal for that adjustment. And I don't personally think the previous supplements had these crazy power shifts. Defense of the North, people adapted really slow. People, even now, are still playing their same old list. And then they run up against the Dragon Emperor, even nerfed, and say, what the heck? And he just bodies them because they are unwilling to adjust their army.
Fight 5 pikes, go burr.
Last time I think we had a big splash. Well, we had two splashes prior. We had Vanquishers of the North, or Vanquishers of not the North, the Necromancer, and then we had Riders of Theoden. Were two like splashy legendary legions. That
was what Gondor at War in 2019, and Vanquishers was it 2021 or 2022?
I can tell you now. It was 21. Yeah.
Yeah, 2021. Yeah.
And so there was it was like a single list that was introduced like in each of those that was like pretty strong, right? And like kind of hard for folks to wrap their head around. Like how do I combat against free heroic combats, free strikes, murder death ball, Rohan, or how do I deal with
so that is just an alpha strike list of hell. It's like, all right, we've all charged in and now we're all popping off. It's like, all right, okay, so how do I deal with that? And then with Vanquishers, it's kind of like magic might makes right.
Yeah. And they there were nerfs that ended up coming in to really adjust that, and there was so much other stuff that was being adjusted like simultaneously. It felt like, actually, probably literally, because like the Alliance Matrix was being adjusted shortly after the Ball of Necromancer book, and or maybe before, I can't remember, but it was like basically like at the same time, and because there was only like two lists that were doing that sort of thing of being like a small model count, hard to deal with because it's an alpha strike or it's invincible or what have you.
Yeah,
it was kind of a different feel than when Defense of the North came out, and then we had this long incubation period afterwards of it felt, it somehow felt like a longer gap between Defense of the North and Rise of Angmar than it did with like the other ones where we probably had like the same amount of time of like a year or 2 years between supplements, or supplements that may quote unquote matter,
yeah, I'm following.
Because, like, I mean, obviously, Scoring the Shire did not, put any splashes in the pond when it came out.
Yeah. No. that one truly is a narrative supplement. Here you go. Here's for the people who really like the last chapter of the third book.
Have I told you guys how? Of course, it's a rumor at the end of the day, but the rumor that I heard on how it got released in its current state.
Go on.
On which one?
Scouring of the Shire.
Oh, okay.
So I was told, of course, there's a lengthy process with dealing with all the licenses and all that, and the structure of GW and reaching to other companies to get all these approvals done and whatnot. And to my knowledge, and we see it at least a little bit, that there is a limited number of expert kits that they can release as a part of these supplements. They can't just do whatever they want.
Right.
What I was told was that the manager or executive that was responsible for saying, hey, you can keep that in, but you got to get rid of that, or you got to shift it around to get to the certain amount of models. The one that would normally do that was on leave during that time. So when it got pushed through, some other person stepped in to do the approval and just slapped a stamp on it and said, let's go. And that's why there's a billion profiles and a billion Forge World models in that supplement.
All of the hobbits.
Because there's just no one to say otherwise, so they just did it.
Every named hobbit gets a thumbs up. The guy was really, really happy to see. Oh yeah, I remember that person's getting named. That hobbit getting named once in a sentence at Bilbo's party. Yeah, he's allowed a model.
there are a lot in there that just make no sense, and their profiles are just random garbage.
Yeah,
there was just seemingly no pruning of that list.
Fair.
Yeah,
fair.
I also love that the Schrodinger's cat of Lotho Saxwell Baggins, made it through the vetting process.
It's still making it through because every question that gets answered doesn't fully answer it.
Yeah. So you could still technically have, fight 10 hero hobbits if you just charge up his will and then dump it all.
That's insane. That is insane.
I mean, people, of course, they make the argument that, clearly you're only supposed to be able to do it once per blah. But the thing is, the blah was never really defined. It said once per phase, but doesn't define which phase. And I don't even think the FAQ answers which phase. It doesn't say how many times per phase. It doesn't say if you can do it, if you did it in the move phase, can you also do it in the other phases? And so if the ruling was it can only be once per phase, but doesn't matter which, then you could still, over the course of the move phase and shoot phase and fight phase, stack up 3 fight value from Lotho. It's so silly. But
who approved this? Who play tested this? What?
Who wanted to turn hobbits into gods? So I pulled them up. It doesn't actually mention any timing outside one of them being when a model declares a charge against him. So it doesn't say when you have to do it or how many times or what phase or any of that. So there seemingly is no limit.
Yeah, and before the FAQ, it used to be that you could, if you crowded all your ruffians around Lotho, you could dump his will to have them all pass their next courage check, and then as long as you weren't playing against terror, that meant that all of them auto-passed the break test because there was no time limit on it. But then they added it in the FAQ that it's until end of turn. But it was so funny, the idea of a bunch of ruffians get paid off in the first turn, and they're like, yeah, I'll stick around when my lads are dying, no problem.
Yeah, we're being surrounded and budgeted by the small folk. It's okay.
I got me money.
I got my money. I'm staying, pal. I'm very loyal to my coin. Someone pays me, I'll do the job till it's done.
I got paid up front. I'm a good employee.
Or die trying. Bloody hell.
Yeah. Oh, God. So funny. I love Lotho so much. I want to I want the financial power to be able to play Sharky's Rogues just so I can bring Lotho to tournaments. Just to have fun. And obviously get shut down in the first round by the TO. But still have that fun moment.
You're just getting giddy thinking about doing it, and then you do it, and then TO, come, can he do this? No. Oh well. That's all I wanted to hear.
I still got whip, so we're good. Speaking, I guess as we're getting a little bit closer to time, I want to kind of swing back to the hype train that is New Edition,
Mm.
and because we've had really good discussion about like the theory of the Allies Matrix and what we think might
Mm.
happen to it, stuff like that.
Yeah.
What are some like broad sort of, and maybe this is a little Christmas right in the Santa wish listing here, but like what are some like neat little things, right? Maybe not big things, they don't have to be big. What are just like some neat little things that you'd be like, man, that'd be really cool if they included that in this new edition?
Well, this is a big one, but take siege weapons out of match play. I want them gone. Please, 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 Jay, but or Santa or whoever I'm writing to, just go siege weapons are for narrative only, or open play. Just just take them out of match play. Oh,
Fair.
I'm sure that makes assault on what is it? Assault on Helm's Deep. Sure, their whole thing is Isengard blisters. It's like, yeah, well, it's a narrative legendary legion, so it can do it there in narrative. It doesn't have to do it in my match play
a
game.
fair way where it's not a general thing, but certain legions get it because they're meant to be siege ones. That's not unreasonable. But even then, I think I'd still personally be okay with removing them altogether. I mean,
Yeah. Thank
even
you.
like the legions, there's only one legion at this point that has siege as part of it, and I mean the ballista in Assault on Helm's Deep has fallen pretty
It went
far
from went
with
from boss
back-to-back
to
nerfs. I mean, rerolling ones reduced it reduced its percent hit from I think it's 75% to like 58.2. I think is the change.
Ooh, okay, you give
That's
math.
that's hopefully memory. I might be quoting it wrong. It reduced it pretty dramatically. And while the scatter doesn't matter as much because at the end of the day the goal was just not to roll a 1, it's still pretty bad when you're dealing with the plethora of blinding lights that are out in the game, where now not only do you have this 6-inch gap where you can't shoot, which is fair, and I think that was the right call. You now have almost no shot to hit blinding light. Or you actually had a little bit of a stronger roll against it. Now they could have done it maybe that against blinding light it would be dropped further, and maybe they could have done that because it does truly not make sense beforehand if you rolled a 5 to be able to re-roll it against blinding light compared to normal needing a 3 less to hit something. I think that would have been fair, but it does feel like that just got nerfed to oblivion. And to be fair, it's a really annoying list to face, but it had its weaknesses. And I don't know that the ballista really carried the day beforehand. I think it was more that maybe some places aren't playing with enough terrain.
Well, sure. I'm willing to make that concession. You get rid of all siege, it can stay in legendary legions where it's involved, though. Sure, why not? I can make that concession. But yeah, that's definitely one thing I want. Another one was that I've seen a lot of talk on the heroics and people wanting challenge revamped. I wouldn't mind seeing heroic strike nerfed from D6 to D3.
See,
I reckon that still makes it viable, but it's not the auto take that it is now. You always want someone with strike in the current game.
Well, I mean, I don't think you might. So I'll see that you might want them, but I don't think you just need them.
Fair, sure.
There are a lot of lists that just flat out wouldn't care. But the problem with the D3 argument is now you're running into situations where you cannot match another hero. There are heroes that you will just never be able to match. And if they just roll lucky and roll 6s, there's just simply no counterplay to it. I think the chance of being able to either outfight them or tie them up at 10 was a stronger way to deal with it. And I don't think that dropping it to D3 will help. I think it will actually make a lot of heroes just pretty useless, or reverse that thought of wanting it to strike isn't worth bothering with because I'm just not going to match the things that I need to match in order to make it work.
Interesting, because I never thought about it that way. I've always thought it as like I get some heroes will no longer be able to even compete with other heroes, but I like that idea. Like there are just some heroes where you shouldn't be able to fight as good as them. Yeah, I know it costs a resource, and it's for a balanced play. But like to me, like Gorbag should not be able to outfight Glorfindel. If Glorfindel gets unlucky, and he doesn't strike, or if he rolls a strike, he rolls a 1, and Gorbag rolls a 4, and it's like, well, Now Gorbag just needs a 6. Maybe they could make a change or improvement to how dueling and the fight system works, like entirely. Like there could just be a nudge one way or the other, but I don't have any ideas myself on how I'd approach changing fight value.
I take this as a personal attack on my Dumbledings. I should be able to strike up and fight the Balrog and then one-shot it. And I will accept no modifications to that. Any modification to that, I'm shutting down.
Hello, I'm Gorolf, and I'm going to heroic strike. Oh, look at that. Me and all 30 of my wildmen and our Huskars are going to cut down the
Balrog on 4s.
Yeah, because Friday shouted, and we two-handed.
I have a fun trivia question for you guys. What is the best that Thryden can wound the Balrog, Durin, and Sauron on?
Freeze?
He can wound, theoretically, if the stars align, he can wound the Balrog and Durin on 2s, and Sauron on 3s.
Oh, is it
pretty good?
Heroic strength.
So he can heroic strength for D3, and he can 2 pierce. So that brings up to 9.
Yeah, he can pierce. Oh!
And he'll have the war cry going off.
Yeah, wow.
So he'll have a +2 at strength 9.
That's great.
So that's why I don't like when people use two-handing as an effective strength modifier, because it doesn't quite work once you hit that level.
Yeah.
You can't really say that he's got strength 13.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that. Always adding +2 strength as like a fast hand for two-handing. You know, I know you could just fast hand and go, it's +1 to wound, but I'm just like, yeah, it's pseudo strength 6. That's what it is. I went from strength 4 to pseudo strength 6 because I'm wounding D6 on 4s. Oh!
Yeah, but in terms of like the fight value stuff, I think the biggest thing they can do is be more willing to adjust how they scale things. I think right now the majority of troops and heroes are fight 3, 4, or 5. We see the more elite heroes or tougher heroes, and in a lot of ways power crept heroes up at fight 6.
Yeah.
And then in terms of fight 7, we see Glorfindel, Elendil, and a few monsters. Fight 8. I mean, I don't even offhand know any fight 8 models except Beorn.
Beorn. Is the Dragon fight 8?
No, Dragon's fight 7.
Dragon's fight 7 as well. Yeah. Wow.
I know that the trolls are fight 7. The Isengard troll is fight 7, and then
is the chief fight 7 too, or is he 8?
I think the chief's fight 7.
Chief's also fight 7. Is what's Gully? Is he 7?
That's a good question.
Or is he 8?
Gully might be 8. Gullivar he's fight 7.
Right. Okay. So then there's this gap of fight 8 where no one's there.
Fight 8 is just not really used. Fight 9 is also not really used. Fight 10 is a single model. I think Fight 9, Gil-galad Sauron. I can't remember if Smaug is Fight 9 or Fight 7. Let me pull him up. Smaug is actually Fight 8. Okay, but he doesn't get seen. I mean, it's Smaug.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's this lack of using those upper end, and I think there's an equal lack of the lower end. Like at Fight 2, you see some hobbits and goblins. At Fight 1, it's basically exclusively a couple Hobbit profiles. Fight 0 technically exists. There's nothing stopping them from using it. So there's like 6 values that just aren't really used that much. And I feel like the scale could be adjusted both to deal with the fight value arms race that keeps coming up, and also to give some buffs to monsters. They could use these as a way to give them a little bit more oomph when they're dealing with like heroes and all that, which is their weakness. Non-hero monsters.
I think like when this topic has come up in the past of like how do we fix fight value, even before the new edition was announced, and just in general, just throughout the editions, is I think like we should see, and the idea of using Fight 0 is actually really smart. I like that idea. So you heard it here first, folks. If it happens in new edition, then Scott called it. But I really think that we should see more profiles like adjusted downward and upward, like Scott said. And I think we could see a lot of hobbits and goblins at 1 and 2. So like Goblin Town could probably be fight 1. Warrior Goblins could maybe be fight 1, but then we'd see more things also get eroded down, because if it's a mountain peak and everything's at fight 5, and we just erode that mountain peak down to a hill and everything kind of flattens out a little bit, throughout the other results, we could see, if Warriors of Minas Tirith are supposed to be highly trained troops, right? Maybe they are fight 4, right? And then, but conversely, things that were previously fight 4 maybe are getting moved up to fight 5. And we're seeing kind of things like, so maybe fighting Uruk-hai move up to fight 5, Elf moves up to fight 6, whatever, right? We're seeing things kind of like Nessalin, so there's kind of different levels.
You're going to be
these
creating a
different
big gap
units.
that way.
Yeah. So I mean, like, well, so for goblins, they probably don't care if they're fight 1 and elves are fight 5 or fight 6, right?
Yeah.
And you have to be careful, of course, of who gets moved to where. So I'm making like a very crude example here, but like Warriors of Rohan might not be as well trained as a Warrior of Minas Tirith, as like a perhaps a clumsy example, but that's like sort of the idea that I'm getting behind.
Yeah, sure.
I also think that I mean the thought towards fight value could also be how it impacts like fainting as a special strike. I don't see it being that problematic for if this gap exists and some armies now are high enough to feint without repercussion, essentially. I don't necessarily see that as a big problem, because I mean half the time when you're using feinting, especially as a higher fight army, you have a spear support. It's basically irrelevant. It would not be the worst thing to provide alternatives to fighting styles where it is not just that simple front and back. You might see an elf fighting at, say they were to move to fight 6 off of this as their base warrior. If they're fighting something that is fight 2, like a goblin, like a higher trained goblin, like you could differentiate black shields versus regular goblins in fight 1 versus fight 2. They're still ultimately going to be far less trained than the average elf. And if an elf splits off from his spear support and could still feint, that doesn't really sound unreasonable. Because now suddenly you don't have to focus as much on this standard 1-to-1 build. You can do a more heavy frontline and look for more flexible ways to fight. I think it provides a little more opening to do that. And then you also get to look at how some of these like upgrades like Black Dragons work with this new scale. Regular Old Easterling is probably about just as trained as a Warrior of Minas Tirith. That I think we would all agree. So it's not unreasonable if they on this new scale were to be fight 4 the same as a Warrior of Minas Tirith. Black Dragon bringing them up to fight 5. They're gonna be more trained, but I still ultimately don't think they're gonna be as trained as an elf, no matter really what they do.
Yeah, no matter what they do, people shouldn't be fighting as good as elves unless
shifting this scale allows to better represent this. Like we're so tight in the scale that we currently have that it's just not represented well. And on top of that, to bring up a thing that I think a lot of people would want to see, unless you specifically play those armies, I feel like these fight buff auras could really be reined in. I think they've been kind of going off the charts as a part of this arms race between 6-inch fight bubbles and 12-inch banners. Inch banners. I think those can be reined in a little. They have an opportunity to do it. Those types of auras for the lists that have them are basically the defining part of the list.
100%.
And while that's not necessarily a bad thing at face value, it does, of course, lead to specific builds, lack of flexibility. You see certain profiles just not coming up. So for Easterlings, especially given the host of the Dragon Emperor, there is basically no reason to take regular Easterlings, even though you could get the same fight value. You have to take the Dragon Emperor. It's just you must. There is no way to make them competitive. Even I've seen some lists where they ally in Easterling Pikes into Mordor. It's just not the same as the Emperor. Ultimately, he will do more. And it's disappointing that some of these lists get punished for that because they're just not as good as they could be. Like it's okay for a list to be less powerful, but it is a punishment for not taking him, which is the difference.
Yeah.
And if they spread out the fight values, it would definitely like even if they kept the auras right as they are, like the Dragon Emperor gets this +1 fight aura. Like if they padded out evened out the distribution of models to fight value, then and there's 2 steps between Easterlings and elves or whatever, maybe we get to then see those auras being useful, but not the end all be all, because some things are going to be better.
Mm.
I ultimately think it is okay for elves to be the best fighting warriors. I don't see a problem.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I really think that there should be defining differences between factions and races in this game.
Yep.
And for elves, it should be that no other warrior faction will match them. They
Yep.
should win their ties.
Yep.
And that's where heroes come in. I mean, heroes are the ones that really end up going for those ties, and that's what the blade's for. I don't think the Elven Blade is meant to be for when warriors tie your elves. It's meant to be when heroes that are going to beat the crap out of them, if they win, tie your elves.
Yeah. Elves should be the smaller, more elite forces, shouldn't they?
Yeah, and if their points just as a consequence of this, I think that's okay, as long as everything balances out.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Like, you really, like, we're expecting improvements on everything, so including points wise. Next thing you know, your Black Numenorians are pointed correctly, because I think they're 1 point under now. Like, if you went off of a baseline of what was it, Warrior Minister, I think Black Numenorians are still a point too cheap. If we started adjusting and making arrangements, like in this complete hypothetical of elves go to fight 6, and next thing you know, Elven Maid does this or that or the other, and they're really high courage, and then you have like a 12-point elf fighting a 8-point warrior of Minas Tirith. Like those 4 points should matter massively. Where right now you could build it in such a way where, sorry, I said a warrior of Minas Tirith, a ranger of Minas Tirith. You can build it in such a way where you have this big banner aura and this regular 8-point dude fighting your higher point elf and murking them, which isn't a really feel good.
It's
that's
one
getting
thing
muddled.
if the dice are poor and you lose a duel and stuff dies. The consequence of how the game works. But it is another thing when you're introducing ties for things that just would not make sense.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to say in my muddled way.
Again, like at the end of the day, it's a competitive game on the match play side of stuff. It doesn't have to be super thematic, but the game is based on thematicism at its core. It should have that influence.
100%. 100%. Have you got anything you want to add, Scott, on anything that you'd like to see changed?
So I've seen a lot of people talking about special strikes and all that.
Yeah.
I am kind of in the opposite camp of it. So while I have an inherent bias towards wanting them, because I do play Isengard, I am a firm believer that if special strikes were to be removed, Isengard would be off the table as a competitive faction, period. I think they are one of the most reliant on them factions between, and I've said in some of my breakdowns, as opposed to alliances being soups, Isengard as a faction is a soup. It has 3 or even 4 very distinct parts of it that work together in a soup-like format, because your army bonus only applies to one of them. Isengard is the biggest user of special strikes between having axes, having swords and daggers, having two-handers, having all these weapons that you could be using them, and you need to be using them to make up realistically the gap of power creep. Like, yes, we got really good fortitude heroes from the Dunlendings, but theirs are still the exact same for the most part. Some of them even cost a little too much, like Huskarls probably cost a point too much. We don't have the troops that are getting that love, so special strikes are really where they make up ground. I actually think there should be more flexibility towards this stuff. I do think they should actually remove the point requirement for weapon swapping. I think that if you have access to a hand weapon of some type, you should just have access to hand weapons. I don't really think if you plop down a sword and an axe in front of an Uruk-hai, it's going to have a moral dilemma between, like, it's going to pick up one of them. It doesn't care. And I think realistically most armories for these factions would have that. They're not going to, like, only make swords. As opposed to axes. I'm sure that, there doesn't need to be elven made axes, but I guarantee that there are axes in those armories.
Well,
There are
yeah, I mean,
flails in those armories.
even in the books, elves do use axes for warfare. Like we know, like it's usually seen as a dwarf thing or an evil thing, but elves used axes in warfare. I mean, but we don't see any in the game, unfortunately.
Like they don't have to be elven made because that's the whole meme is elven made axes, which is why they said weapon swapping doesn't take those things. But I
Yes.
do feel like, and it doesn't have to be blanket access. Maybe it
Yeah.
is like the same way that orcs or Morannon orcs have a few different weapons they can pick. I
Yes.
think more models could have that.
Yeah. That's fair.
Like, of course, it might require some kit bashing. It always does. They're not going to suddenly produce a warrior of Ministerial with a flail, even though that's literally the example that they use in the book, is a warrior of Ministerial with a flail. I think if that were to happen, we would see more of these unique special strikes. As much as people like to say they use bash en masse, I really still don't see it that often. It feels like it's much more specific players using that as a tactic than actual armies deciding that. And more armies could have access to that. More armies could have clubs. More armies could have flails. I feel like if you didn't have a point assignment, you could see more variety.
It kind of opens that up, doesn't it? It really does.
And between that, and I know that there's been some talk about them actually restricting war gear down to what is seen on screen, or I would assume explicitly described in books. I think it should kind of be the opposite. I feel like there are some war gear options that aren't in profiles that should be. I think certain things should, like, it doesn't quite make sense for, in my Dunland, for example, that a warrior of Dunland can take a banner, but a Huskarl can't. But I could pass it to a Huskarl as soon as that warrior dies.
100%. Yeah.
Which, as people have seen me do, I'll get the warrior killed on purpose to hand to a bodyguarded Huskarl. Now, of course, sometimes it could be a consideration of the profile being powerful, and if you toss a banner on it, it makes it more powerful. But I mean, it could always be a swap, like other factions. Like you could have to pay some in some sense on top of the banner. So like Guard of the Fountain Court or Guard of the Galadrim Court, Warriors of Arnor, they lose their spear weapon in order to take it, which is it's mostly just about the fact that you could always hand it off anyway. There's ways to get your own models killed.
Yeah,
and it just feels like a limiting factor that doesn't need to be there.
Yeah.
If I'm gonna have to kit bash a banner anyway to hand off, there just doesn't feel like a reason I couldn't just take it.
Yeah, that's fair. I wouldn't mind seeing that. You know, I think there should be universal war gear that you can just add to every profile, not except for heroes.
And that exists for a lot of other games. Where it's just these items every group can take. Especially with like the rank and flank ones, they all have access to this. Especially like the old War of the Ring game. I think virtually every type of contingent was able to take banners or war horns and all that.
I think that'd be a good change, to be fair,
We see a lot that it just doesn't really make sense for them not to be able to take it here.
100%. Aye. I'm from Special Strikes to war gear.
Of course, we can always bring up our buddy who, on foot, led a third of the Pelennor Field's Rohirrim, Grimbold. Because apparently he didn't have a horse.
Yeah. Probably not, despite in the film.
Quite make any reasonable sense for him not to have a horse. Like, I mean, I know why he doesn't, because of course they haven't changed his profile in some time, but he was on a horse leading a
He was on a horse.
Rohirrim. He was
on a horse, and he's a captain of a horse nation. Horse riding nation. Where's his horse?
It can be argued that not every hero needs a horse. That's typically the argument with Celeborn. Even though a lot of people would like to see him on a horse, he doesn't need a horse. It's not the same for things like Grimbold. It just isn't. He is literally a Rohirrim.
Yeah,
he also literally
missing
has
a key
a horse
part
in the movie.
Yeah, on a horse. They could fix up some of that stuff, and if they were to remove some non-visualized war gear to make up for it, I'd be okay with it. I mean, personally, I don't even think we see Citadel Guard at any point in the movies at all. So, like, their profile that has this, they have horses, they have these bows or spears, and we don't even see them. Why do we have that, but we don't have Grimbold on a horse?
Yeah.
I'm okay making that trade, personally.
Yeah, for sure. for sure.
I don't even play Rohan, and I'm okay making that trade.
Yeah.
Grimble deserves
I kill Rohan. I'm making it harder on myself as a dumbling.
He can be the sole Rohan hero on horseback who's two-handing all the time.
I mean, yeah, everyone calls him Diet Thryden because he's Thryden who doesn't have a horse and is on foot, and I think he's only fight 4, I believe.
Diet Thryden's hilarious.
He's fight 5.
Oh, he's fight 5. Oh, he doesn't, but he doesn't have an alternate hand weapon, which again is something that's really weird.
Yeah.
There's very few. So that's another one. There's very few profiles that are forced two-handers. I really don't think they should be forced two-handers.
Mm.
I feel like every model should have an alternative. It makes some profiles just unreasonable to play.
Yeah.
Like Kamul in Dark Powers. Like I see the use case for him. He will always be the 9th Nazgul that I take, which means in all points I will never be taking him because he will never be in that army. I would have to be exclusively playing 0 Castellan 1,000 points.
Well, yeah, that's why 1,000 points I took.
I take the keeper
the Necromancer, all of the Nazgul, and the keeper, because that was 1,000 points on the nose. Despite having Pestilence to hand, I was like, I'll do it. And to be fair, Kamul was my top killer, but I mean, I got lucky in one event where he's there going, yeah, I've rolled a 5 high, but you've rolled a 5, and I'm fight 5, so bonk, dead. I think, Commi, you mentioned something about two-handing where you'd like, what was it, the broadswords special rule to just be a flat thing for all two-handers?
Yeah, if every two-hander got to keep their natural 6 when they roll it instead of having it reduced, that would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
Because then you can kind of have that, because, I mean, it's a huge trope that the two-handers are clumsy and can't be used as deftly and agile, and that's why they have a -1. But that's also false.
It 100% is false.
But it's a game mechanic, right? It's a game mechanic, and this is a game to do game stuff, and so that's why it's there. And so if they gave them the broadside rule universally, and then the Lamadon folks, they get to keep a 5+ or whatever, right? Like they get to keep a 4+ or whatever.
Yeah.
In order to make it, equitable for them, then great. Because then you would probably see a lot more two-handers taken in general without it being a cry, sad, bad, frown, face sort of occasion.
Yeah, it goes from being like, I've put a couple in just to gang up on stuff to, here's my blob of two-handers who hopefully are quite effective.
Just look at Grimbold. Like, if Grimbold could roll his dice, right, and get a 6, suddenly Grimbold being a fight 5 two-hander mighty blow model is a lot more terrifying because you're trying to dodge Grimbold's 6 instead of dodge Grimbold rolling anything higher and you not getting the 6.
Yeah, you can burn through Grimbold's might real quick, knocking the 6s down to 5s back up to 6s, and that's a good way to just keep throwing like your fight 5 warriors at him. And it's like, well, I don't want to be losing to a bunch of fight 5 warriors. I'll spend the might. I'll spend the might. It's like, oh, Grimbold, that's sad.
Yeah, I play a very aggressive Grimbold, which has actually netted my Grimbold a lot of one-shots on various heroes that you wouldn't expect Grimbold to be taking on.
Brilliant.
And it's been great. I love Grimbold.
We like anecdotal.
I just love I love watching Grimbold flash kill Bolg or the White Wargs or Azog, because they just think they're gonna heroic combat off of him, and Grimbold just lops their head off because he's Grimbold.
Yeah, brilliant.
And it's great stuff, especially when you throw in a cheap strike hero to back him up so that he can heroic strength while they heroic strike, and then he just one shots the enemy.
Yeah. Here's 2 wounds. Fate that fucker.
To round out, because we're at time basically, but we'll tack on.
Yeah,
a
no
bit,
worries.
There is I have a lot of different little things that I think would be really nice to see. For example, Samwise getting 2 attacks, but there are 2 things that I think would be really important that I would love to see that hasn't been already mentioned, and one of them is a really small detail, and this is kind of, and maybe this can be seen as very nitpicky. But I mean this with the best of intention. I think there could be some more clarification on 2 kinds of rules when it comes to shooting. One is the in the way, and the examples used to describe it, it's based on the line of sight, not based on overlapping bases, like just adding a picture. The other small thing as it regards to shooting is a bit of clarification and adjustment to define how light and dark interact on the tabletop. So we have
Mm.
blinding light, and how it's 6 inches, and then out to another 6 inches it's another kind of light. And we see blinding light. We have all these debates on what does it mean if an archer who has Cave Dweller is in blinding light shooting at someone who's in blinding light, and all this stuff. And there's a lot of common sense rulings to define it, right? Obviously, if you are in light, you are no longer in the cover of darkness, and you're not getting the bonus, right? But the game doesn't really take that into account. Even the FAQs don't fully cover the various combinations of how people are in shadow or not in shadow, and how that works for shooting. So I just would love to see just like a little bit of clarification on light, or maybe we just don't have those rules anymore. Either is fine for me.
Yeah.
The larger slice of the pie that I would love to
Yeah.
have involved in the new edition is I would love to see monsters getting some sort of knock to the ground, or some sort of improvement, right? Improved movement, like 8-inch move, or they're getting all monsters across the board get a baby version of Monstrous Charge built in, and then Monstrous Charge itself is about knocking over other monsters. So a normal monster, if it charges in against cavalry or smaller, it gets the knock to the ground rule itself. It doesn't get extra attack, because it's just it being really big. And then Monstrous Charge gives it +1 attack, and then it can knock over monsters of its strength and smaller, or whatever, or all monsters. Like, who cares? Like, let a cave troll push over Sauron.
Yep.
Because we just don't see it, because we don't see those monsters. And I think if we got to have more kaiju battles of monsters on the tabletop, it would be so much fun. There was a tournament that happened here in New England where everybody brought their list. It was good versus evil, and on the boards were monsters for each side that were just added to your army for free, as if it was a Green Alliance. And you got to see kaiju battles of like Balrog versus a dragon, or you got to see trolls versus Ents, stuff like that, in the midst of like elves and dwarves and whatever fighting each other. And the folks that I regretfully was not able to attend, but the folks that participated loved that. It was so much fun for them. And you can actually hear a report on it in the Unexpected podcast, where I think episode about monsters, Matt Iverson talks about his experience at that tournament. And he's a very competitive player, but he went to this event where it had that bit of an open format touch where monsters got included, and he said, it was like one of the best tournaments that he'd ever, played in, because it was just so fun to see trolls throwing dudes around while you're also playing strategy battle game.
Yeah.
And I would love just to see monsters given that love, that little bit of a spotlight, so that they aren't just useless point sinks that aren't as good as 10 Uruk-hai for the same amount of points,
Yeah, I get what you mean. You just give monsters something, a little boost to make them that much more viable in certain armies. Because, like, getting a cave troll in what it's Angmar and Moria that they're in, they're both reasonably cost. As you say, the Mordor troll or the Isengard troll, it's kind of like, well, I do not want to include you, because I can get like way more point efficient things instead. Because they're just swingy and therefore unreliable. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I love monsters.
Yeah, monsters getting something would be ace, I reckon. If they got something in this new edition, just something to make them that much more viable. Something that's, well, not viable. Well, yeah, viable. Just not a better choice, but like it's more reason to choose them. More reason, like, where you're not picking them and you're going, I've picked this for the fun, but I know it's not going to be as great in my head.
Going back to the theme of a lot of my notes is basically making it more of a choice.
Yeah,
not
make it more of a choice.
Just black and white. I can pick an Isengard troll or an entire warband worth of Uruk-hai.
Aye.
I'm gonna pick the entire warband of Uruk-hai every time.
Same. Every time.
And it shouldn't be that. It should be, maybe I could do more with a bunch of Uruk-hai, but maybe I could do more with a troll. It provides this alternate use, and it is a good enough use that is worth it. And I just don't see that represented with almost any monster.
And it's also like the thematics of it too, because like one of my favorite moments in all of the Lord of the Rings movies is that particular scene where Gandalf tells all the words minister to hold the line no matter what comes through that gate, and then 3 giant F-off trolls barge through the gate and start slaughtering words ministers and chucking them everywhere. And like that's that moment in the movie and that moment in the video game, the Return of the King video game, was so fun because they're so terrifying, and I want to be on the receiving end of like a bunch of trolls barreling through my army, and I also want to be the one who's steering the trolls. Like being able to feel cool because you're using a big monster. Like you get to see people feel really cool because you're using a Lendo, and a Lendo butchers 7 models per turn. But like
Yep.
I want to see a monster, wade through a battle line and actually wade through it. Like if now this probably would never work, but here's an example of like a rule that monsters could have to give you that feel is that monsters kind of have a built-in barge, but it
Yep.
like can enforce makeways or whatever, and then they get to follow up. So then the the sea is literally parting before them because they're so big and they're swinging their clubs around. Like something that captures their ability to just
Mulch through
literally
people.
sweep the floor. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
Smog does that very well because Smog, when he barges, does a strength 9 hit.
Yeah.
And
If
that
barge
could
on
be
it-
represented with
Yeah.
these monsters where it doesn't need to be a strength 9. It shouldn't be a strength 9 if
Yeah.
it's not Smog. But it could be a strength value where it does actually knock some troops out. So it's not just like, hey, I need to decide. I'm fighting one guy. I know I want to barge, but if I can only get into one guy after, I might as well just kill him. But now it's, hey, I might be able to also kill him from the barge and then go kill someone else and start making some points back.
yeah,
Oh, that's
they got like
a-
strength 4 impact hits when they barge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like they have like I can't even call it a diet heroic combat. And imagine if they have like a heroic combat where it's like it doesn't go first, but when your monster kills something, if they kill something, they can then like move D6 and fight again, and move D6 and fight again.
Well,
until they're beaten. In a duel.
One thought that I'm having kind of on the spot, but I think it was mentioned as a possibility for the upcoming Hill Trolls, is they might be independent heroes.
Right.
And if you made monsters independent heroes and you give them a little bit of resources apiece, that could actually help them out tremendously. So
yeah, imagine if all monsters had like 1 might, 1 will, 1 fate, or 0 fate.
Probably 0 fate, but one might get them out of a sticky situation. Of course, they shouldn't have heroics because I think that should be reserved for actual heroes, not just monsters getting the stats. And then 1 will, and of course, like prevent them from standfast. So literally treat them as an independent, a regular monster that just has heroic stats. But I think you have to classify them as a hero to give them heroic stats.
Yeah, unless monster became its own new classification.
Unless they make a new, they could make a new classification. That could help as well.
They also have precedent for that because Shadowfax is neither a horse nor a hero.
That's true, actually.
Yeah, actually.
And he's got those will and fate or whatever, right? So they already have things with heroic stats that probably should just be labeled as a hero, but they already have things that have heroic stats without being, and that is in fact Shadowfax himself.
Yeah, Shadowfax. Yeah, he is one of them. It makes sense. Yeah. No.
So, they don't need like an overwhelming change, but just a little bump that makes them more flexible and gets them in situations. I think will help a lot.
Aye, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Oops, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Even if they gave trolls independent hero status and let them like have a 3-inch stand fast, like or even a 6-inch. I mean, like if you're an orc and you're watching this troll being like, yeah, let's go, and he's still murdering dudes, like maybe you still stick around that troll a little bit.
You see a troll running in, give me the chicken. I'm going with him.
Yeah, time's up. Let's do this.
Oh, that's fair. I think that's an excellent point because, as you said before, we are running up on time. But that's actually a decent idea that we threw out there, something to sign off on. I think.
Yeah, we just gotta get Jay Clear to hire us as his dedicated consultant, and we're good.
Mate, watch this episode will blow up. Jay will hear it and go, "That's a great idea." Back to the board.
So here's the thing on that front, and I'm gonna ask him directly. I'm hoping that he's at Nova, so I can ask him. I am like just so convinced. It is my headcanon that he's seen the FAQ list that I keep coordinating and submitting amongst other people with, I counted it, it's got 209 questions on it.
Brilliant.
And basically said, well, shit. I can't answer those. I need a new book. Because
Scott
Yeah,
and his
you
team
could
are the reason we've got a new edition.
you could take a whole bunch of questions off that are kind of just like silly, like devil's advocate, more change suggestion ones. But the core of it still is that there are a ton of things that need answering,
Yeah.
and while some might value certain questions over other, at the end of the day, I think all of them need an answer. And I
Yep.
don't think it is possible for them to FAQ these. They would have to be doing it for the next 10 years. At a
Yep.
certain point, the questions build up to where you need a book.
Yep.
Yeah.
Fair,
And
man.
I
Fair.
could see that being one of the reasons. And I'm going to ask him if he has read this list because I'm pretty convinced he has.
I'm hoping like another minor thing, and I guess maybe this is what closes us out. But I'm hoping that part of, if that's true, for example, especially if that's true, that Scott's list is pushing this next edition, is that we see just a language shift, for lack of a better term, in the way that the book is written, to be less colloquial. Because I mean, Games Workshop's rules have always been very colloquial, very conversational, very casual, and has taken certain liberties to assume that the readers know one thing or the other. I mean, just look at the whole debacle over how fights were paired, and
Yep.
how, in one way of reading it, in a very casual way, you're like, oh, this is how it works. And then, but if you read it this other way, that's how it works. And then one of those won out, right? And
Neither
I
of them won
would
out,
love.
actually.
Oh yeah,
Because they had to change it.
but I would love to see that there is a design shift in the way that they write the language to be a little more formulaic. I'd like
So they
to
spell
see a
stuff out.
bit. Yeah, like we'll either spell stuff out, or kind of give you more of just like, if you, and they're not the best design company in the world by far. But if we look at games like, say, Fantasy Flight Games, or even some of the other ones out there, where they kind of give you like some bullet list walkthroughs for different step processes, that instead of like a block of text that then stops using certain words that are not in bold or should be in bold or whatever. Like when I've been revisiting the X-Wing game, long may it rest in peace, there's a lot of functions in there that the rules just are a bit easier to understand and read, because it kind of just like walks you through it,
Yep.
and walks you through it with consistent language. And so
Yep.
it's, when you're doing an attack, you're going to be using this, and this is the order of those events. And I would love to see that kind of happen with strategy battle game, because I love how simple it is. It's simple to learn, right? Really hard to then learn everything, because it's like an iceberg, where you can have 100% the amount of fun that's available with the game when you're new, and then you can.
Yep.
But for some reason, that 100% number just grows in font size, because
Yep.
you're now learning more and more about the depth of the game.
Yeah.
And would
You
love to
start with
see.
you start with X does Y, and then you end with the superior Easterling horse.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm being wrong.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's that. Yeah, I'd just love to see the game become more accessible in that way. But yeah, and I guess that's kind of the philosophy that I have in mind for the game overall. I'd love to see it become more accessible, and the collation of all the profiles together, clear rules design, stuff like that. Everything in the name of making this game grow in the community would be a win for me.
I definitely agree with that, because one other thing that I have learned through this game, especially because my history was not with games not written in another language, but written in another form of my language, because obviously the game is written with more British English. There is differences in how things are described or said between American English, even Canadian English, British English, or just English that people are learning as a second language throughout Europe and Asia. And I think a lot of these inconsistencies happen because it's not written in a manner that is kind of consistent between these different forms of English. And
Right.
how you're suggesting would help deal with a lot of that. It's basically the explain it like I'm 5 type approach. And I think the game assumes at this stage that you're not 5, you're 20.
Right. They assume that you're still the same guy that's been playing this since since 2001.
Yeah.
And which is fair, because but it's becoming less and less fair, because we're like, so many new players are showing up, like basically every day now. Because I mean, if we just look in our introduce yourself channel, every day it's someone saying that I'm new to the game or I'm just coming back, and I would love to be able to have a nice, welcome sign for them in the form of this new edition that is more accessible, easier to navigate. And this is an easier rule set to navigate than the other ones for sure. But you can always improve, as Jay Claire has said himself. With that, we are well over time, so I am going to thank you, Scott, for participating with us on this very haphazardly scheduled recording session. It was a pleasure to be able to chat with you. It was a pleasure to be able to chat with King.
Yeah, he's been very helpful, hasn't he?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for dealing with me so early in the morning.
Not a problem. All right, dear listeners, there may well be a part 2 to this. Maybe perhaps not with the same guest, maybe a new face for this when the edition drops. So keep your eyes out.
You can't have too much of me. That's too much.
Aye.
Listen to me ramble on it. No, I wouldn't suggest it to my worst enemies.
Aye.
Keep your eyes out for new edition, new me 2 in the future. But thanks, and take care. Have a good day.
Everyone take care.